Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Kurt Goldstein, the neurologist who found wholeness in the wounded organism. Together and apart, they explored the fundamental human drive toward completeness, one through symbol and myth, the other through biology and behavior. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approach human becoming one, seeing the psyche's mythic journey through archetypal territory, the other discovering the organism's biological striving towards self-realization. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most: the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Goldstein as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. In the early years of the 20th century, two young physicians stood at different thresholds, gazing into the mysterious territory of the human condition. One worked in a Swiss psychiatric hospital, surrounded by patients whose minds had fragmented into incomprehensible pieces. The other worked in German neurological wards, tending to soldiers whose brains had been shattered by war's brutal machinery. Both men would dedicate their lives to understanding how human beings become whole, but they would take profoundly different paths toward that understanding. Carl Gustav Jung, born in 1875 in the quiet Swiss village of Keswil, came of age in a world where the invisible realms of mind and spirit held equal weight with the visible world of matter. His father was a pastor, a man whose faith had grown hollow with doubt, and young Carl felt the tension between religious yearning and intellectual honesty from his earliest days. He grew up reading widely in philosophy, theology, and the emerging science of psychiatry. By the time he arrived at the Burgosli Hospital in Zurich in 1899, he carried within him a question that would shape his entire life's work. How do we understand the irrational contents of the human psyche without reducing them to mere pathology? The Burgosli was then under the direction of Eugen Bleuler, a pioneering psychiatrist who treated his patients with unprecedented humanity and curiosity. Here, Jung encountered men and women whose minds produced elaborate systems of delusion, whose speech contained strange repetitions and apparent nonsense, whose behavior defied ordinary understanding. Rather than simply cataloging symptoms, Jung listened. He listened to the patterns beneath the chaos. He listened to the stories his patients told, the symbols that emerged in their confused speech, the emotional resonances that accompanied certain words and images. In 1902, he began his word association experiments, measuring patients' reaction times to various stimulus words and noting where hesitations and emotional disruptions occurred. These experiments revealed what he called complexes, emotionally charged clusters of ideas and memories that existed partly outside conscious awareness, exerting their influence on thought and behavior. But Jung's curiosity extended far beyond the consulting room. He read voraciously in mythology, comparative religion, alchemy, and ancient philosophy. He studied the Gnostic texts, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the Upanishads, medieval mysticism, and contemporary anthropology. What fascinated him was the way similar images and narrative patterns appeared across cultures and epochs, suggesting some deeper layer of the psyche that transcended individual experience. When he met Sigmund Freud in 1907, he found a mentor who seemed to offer a framework for understanding these unconscious depths. For 6 years, their collaboration was intense and productive, with Jung serving as Freud's designated heir to the psychoanalytic movement. Yet, even during those years of alliance, tensions simmered. Freud insisted that sexuality was the primary driving force of the unconscious mind. Jung, while acknowledging sexuality's importance, sensed something broader, more numinous, at work in the psyche. When their break came in 1913, it was not merely intellectual, but deeply personal, plunging Jung into what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of several years in which he deliberately engaged with his own dreams, visions, and fantasies, recording them in what would become known as the Red Book. During this tumultuous time, he encountered figures and images that seemed to arise from a source deeper than his personal history. He called this source the collective unconscious, a layer of the psyche inherited by all humanity, containing what he termed archetypes, universal patterns of image and narrative that structure human experience. By the 1920s, Jung had articulated his mature vision of analytical psychology. Human psychological development, he proposed, was not simply about adjusting to society's demands or resolving childhood conflicts. It was a journey he called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming more fully oneself, of integrating the conscious ego with the unconscious aspects of personality, of reconciling opposites within the conscious psyche to achieve a kind of wholeness symbolized by what he called the self. This journey necessarily involved encounters with archetypal figures, the shadow, representing disowned aspects of personality, the anima or animus, representing contrasexual elements within each person, the wise old man or great mother, representing spiritual guidance and nurturing, and ultimately the self, the archetype of wholeness and totality. Jung's patients undertook this journey through dream analysis, active imagination, and the exploration of mythological and religious symbols that resonated with their personal experiences. Jung's psychology was thus fundamentally mythic and teleological. He saw the psyche as purposeful, moving toward greater consciousness and integration. Psychological symptoms were not merely malfunctions to be eliminated, but messages from the unconscious, attempts by the psyche to restore balance and promote growth. A neurosis might represent the one-sidedness of conscious attitude, meeting resistance from neglected aspects of personality. Depression might signal that the current direction of life had become meaningless and a deeper transformation was necessary. Jung believed that the psyche possessed an inherent wisdom, a self-regulating capacity that, if properly understood and engaged, could guide the individual toward authentic selfhood. This vision of psychology was inseparable from Jung's engagement with spirituality, alchemy, mythology, and what he called the symbolic life. He believed modern people suffered especially from a loss of connection to the symbolic dimension, trapped in literal-mindedness and materialism. True psychological health required reconnection with the numinous, those experiences of awe, mystery, and transcendent meaning that organized and vitalized the personality. His later works explored synchronicity, the I Ching, UFO phenomena, and Gnostic Christianity, always seeking to articulate a psychology that honored both scientific rigor and the irreducible mystery of human consciousness. Now let us turn to the other figure in our story. Born in the same historical moment, but emerging from a quite different world, Kurt Goldstein entered life in 1878 in Upper Silesia, then part of the German Empire, now part of Poland. His family was Jewish, though increasingly assimilated into German culture, and young Kurt grew up in an atmosphere that valued education, rational inquiry, and scientific progress. Where Jung's childhood was colored by religious questions and spiritual yearnings, Goldstein's formation was shaped by the confident positivism of late 19th century medicine. He studied medicine in Breslau and later in Heidelberg. Drawn particularly to neurology, the study of the brain and nervous system, which promised to unlock the mysteries of human behavior through careful anatomical and physiological investigation. Goldstein's early career was conventional for a brilliant, young neurologist of his era. He studied with some of the leading figures in German neurology, learning to identify lesions in the brain by analyzing specific deficits in patient behavior. This was the age of localization, when researchers believed they could map specific mental functions to particular brain regions. Damage to Broca's area produced characteristic speech difficulties. Damage to the visual cortex produced blindness. Damage to motor areas produced paralysis. The brain appeared to be an intricate machine whose parts could be understood in isolation. But then came the First World War, and with it, a transformation in Goldstein's thinking that would define the rest of his career. In 1914, he was assigned to work with soldiers who had sustained brain injuries in combat. These were catastrophic wounds, shrapnel-piercing skulls, bullets lodging in brain tissue, concussive forces shattering neural pathways. The patients Goldstein encountered at the Frankfurt Neurological Institute had not merely lost specific functions. Their entire way of being in the world had been altered. A soldier with a lesion in the parietal lobe could not simply fail at particular tasks. He seemed to exist differently, perceiving space and his body's relationship to it in fundamentally changed ways. A patient with frontal damage did not merely lose certain executive functions. His whole personality, his capacity for abstraction, his ability to imagine alternative possibilities seemed compromised. As Goldstein worked intimately with these wounded men over months and years of rehabilitation, he began to question the prevailing doctrine of strict localization. Yes, damage to specific brain regions produced characteristic symptoms, but the total picture of each patient could not be understood as merely the sum of isolated deficits. The organism as a whole was attempting to adapt, to reorganize itself, to achieve some new equilibrium in the face of catastrophic disruption. Goldstein observed that patients developed elaborate compensatory strategies, that symptoms fluctuated depending on context and emotional state, that the same anatomical lesion produced varying behavioral consequences depending on the individual's overall constitution and situation. This led Goldstein to articulate what he called the holistic, or organismic approach to neurology and psychology. The organism, he proposed, must be understood as a unified whole, not as a collection of separate functions. Brain and body, perception and action, thought and emotion, all these formed an integrated system whose properties could not be predicted simply by studying isolated components. When injury or disease disrupted this system, the entire organism responded, attempting to achieve a new form of organization that would permit continued functioning. The specific symptoms we observe are not simply the direct effects of local damage. They represent the whole organism's attempt to cope with that damage, to establish what Goldstein called ordered behavior in the face of catastrophic disruption. Consider one of Goldstein's most famous case studies, a patient he called Schneider, a soldier who sustained a mine splinter wound to the occipital region of his brain. Schneider could still see, in the sense that he could identify objects in his visual field, but he had lost what Goldstein described as the capacity for abstract visual behavior. He could not point to a spot on his body unless he actually moved that body part. He could not imagine visual scenes or trace patterns in the air. His visual world had become concrete, tied to immediate sensory givens, lacking the flexible, symbolic character that normally allows us to mentally manipulate and transform what we see. But Schneider did not simply lack a function. His entire way of engaging with the world had reorganized around this limitation. He developed elaborate verbal strategies to compensate for his perceptual difficulties. His personality, his emotional life, his relationships, all reflected this global reorganization. Goldstein was struck by how Schneider's injury affected not just his vision, but his capacity for what Goldstein called the abstract attitude, the ability to transcend the immediate concrete situation, to think hypothetically, to perceive similarities and differences, to organize experience according to general principles rather than specific particulars. This abstract attitude, Goldstein came to believe, was fundamental to human existence. It allowed us to have a world rather than merely responding to stimuli. It enabled language, conceptual thought, planning, imagination, and the symbolic life. When brain damage impaired this abstract capacity, the patient became more concrete, more stimulus-bound, more rigidly tied to immediate circumstances. Yet even in their concreteness, Goldstein's patients were not mere automata. They were still striving toward something. They were attempting to achieve what Goldstein called self-realization, the organism's fundamental tendency to actualize its capacities, to become what it potentially can become. For a brain-injured patient, self-realization might mean finding new ways to accomplish daily tasks, developing compensatory strategies that allowed some degree of ordered existence. For a healthy person, it meant the full flowering of abilities and potentials. But in both cases, the direction was the same, toward greater actualization, toward a state Goldstein sometimes described as coming to terms with the world. This concept of self-realization became central to Goldstein's mature theory. Unlike Freud, who saw the organism as driven primarily by the need to reduce tension and return to equilibrium, Goldstein viewed the organism as fundamentally creative and expansive. The most basic tendency was not toward rest, but toward activity, toward expressing one's nature, toward mastery and growth. Pathology occurred not when instincts broke through repression, but when the organism's capacity for self-realization was blocked or distorted. Anxiety, in Goldstein's view, arose when the organism was confronted with tasks or situations it could not adequately master, producing what he called a catastrophic reaction, a state of panic and disorganization in the face of overwhelming demands. After the war, Goldstein continued developing these ideas, working in Berlin and publishing his most significant works in the late 1920s and 30s. His book, The Organism, published in 1934, represented the fullest articulation of his organismic theory. But by then, the political situation in Germany was becoming untenable. As a Jew, Goldstein was stripped of his positions when Hitler came to power in 1933. He was briefly imprisoned, released, and fled first to Amsterdam, then to the United States, where he would spend the remainder of his career, teaching and writing, primarily in New York. In America, Goldstein's influence spread beyond neurology into broader psychological and philosophical circles. His emphasis on holism, self-realization, and the organism's creative capacities resonated with emerging currents in American thought. Thinkers like Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, who would become central to humanistic psychology, acknowledged Goldstein as an important precursor to their own emphasis on growth, potential, and self-actualization. Yet Goldstein himself remained primarily a neurologist and a phenomenologist, committed to describing the concrete realities of organismic functioning without indulging in what he saw as metaphysical speculation. Did Jung and Goldstein ever meet? Did they read each other's works with care? The historical record suggests their paths did not directly cross in any significant way. Jung's world was primarily Swiss and, later, increasingly international, but centered on depth psychology and analytical practice. Goldstein's world was German neurology, then American academic medicine and psychology. They published in different journals, attended different conferences, addressed different audiences. Yet they were contemporaries, both active in the formative decades of 20th century psychology, both grappling with the fundamental question of human wholeness and development. If we seek explicit references, we find only glancing mentions. Jung occasionally cited neurological research, including work from Goldstein's milieu, but did not engage deeply with organismic theory. Goldstein, for his part, was skeptical of psychoanalytic approaches, viewing them as too speculative, too removed from the concrete realities of brain and behavior that neurological study revealed. He saw the unconscious as an unnecessary hypothesis, preferring to speak of the organism's total functioning, some aspects of which might be unreflected or unthematized, but which did not require positing a separate realm of unconscious mental content. Yet despite this historical distance and methodological wariness, there is a profound resonance between these two thinkers, and that resonance centers on the concept that gives this exploration its title, self-realization. For both Jung and Goldstein, human existence could not be understood in purely mechanistic terms, as if we were merely reactive creatures responding to stimuli or driven by instinctual forces seeking discharge. Both saw human beings as fundamentally oriented toward something more, toward wholeness, toward actualization, toward becoming more fully what we potentially are. But the terms in which they understood this drive, the methods by which they studied it, and the implications they drew from it diverged in ways that illuminate the very nature of psychology itself. When Jung spoke of individuation, he described a process saturated with meaning, symbolism, and spiritual significance. The journey towards selfhood required engaging with the autonomous figures of the unconscious, the shadow, the anima, the wise old man, each representing aspects of personality that must be recognized, related to, and integrated. This journey unfolded through dreams, fantasies, and the resonance between personal experience and universal mythological patterns. The self that emerged through individuation was not simply the sum of conscious and unconscious contents, but a mysterious center and totality, something that Jung described in quasi-mystical terms, using symbols like the mandala to represent its wholeness and centrality. When Goldstein spoke of self-realization, he described an organismic process grounded in biological functioning and observable behavior. The organism strives to actualize its capacities, to achieve ordered and adequate performance in its environment. This striving is not driven by mysterious archetypes, but by the fundamental nature of living systems, their tendency toward maintaining and enhancing organized functioning. Self-realization occurs when the organism can fully express its capabilities, when it can effectively cope with its world without the catastrophic anxiety that signals inadequate mastery. The achieved state is not a mystical union of opposites, but a harmonious, flexible adaptation in which the organism's potentials find appropriate realization. Here we encounter a puzzle that will occupy us throughout this exploration. Are Jung and Goldstein describing the same phenomenon in different languages, or are they actually addressing fundamentally different aspects of human existence? Is the individuating psyche and the self-realizing organism essentially the same reality viewed from different angles, or are we dealing with two distinct processes that happen to share some vocabulary? This question has no simple answer, but in exploring it, we discover something essential about the challenges and possibilities of understanding human beings. As you rest now, letting these two figures take shape in your mind's eye, notice how each man carries his own history, his own way of seeing. Jung with his dreams and visions, his dialogues with the dead, his fascination with alchemy's symbolic transformations. Goldstein with his brain-injured soldiers, his careful observations of behavior, his commitment to describing what can be seen and measured. Both are physicians, both are devoted to healing, both believe deeply in the possibility of human transformation. Yet they stand in different territories, using different tools, seeing different landscapes. The conversation between them, whether they ever actually spoke or not, is a conversation about the very ground on which psychology stands. Let us now move deeper into their respective visions, comparing not just their concepts but the entire orientation each brought to human existence. In this comparison, we will discover not only their differences, but the creative tension that makes their dialogue so illuminating. When Jung looked at a patient, what did he see? He saw not simply an individual person with a particular history and set of symptoms, but a manifestation of eternal patterns, a specific embodiment of universal human struggles. A young man suffering from depression might be understood as caught between the demands of his persona, the social mask he presents to the world, and the unlived life gestating in his unconscious. A woman struggling with relationship difficulties might be viewed as projecting her undeveloped animus onto partners, seeking in external men the masculine qualities she has not recognized in herself. An older person facing life's decline might be in the throes of what Jung called the second half of life, when the tasks shift from achievement and adaptation to reflection and integration. Jung's case studies read like spiritual dramas. He recounts dreams filled with mythological imagery, fantasies that unfold like ancient narratives, symptoms that reveal themselves as meaningful messages from the unconscious. When a patient dreams of descending into a cave and encountering a wise old man, Jung does not simply interpret this as wish fulfillment or anxiety. He recognizes the archetypal pattern, the descent into the underworld, the meeting with the guide, the threshold of transformation. He might explore with the patient what this image means personally, but he also situates it within the broader context of human symbolic expression. The dream connects the individual's unique situation to humanity's perennial questions about mortality, wisdom, and renewal. This approach required what Jung called symbolic thinking, the capacity to recognize that images and narratives mean more than they literally depict, that they point toward psychological and spiritual realities that cannot be captured in purely rational language. For Jung, the psyche naturally expressed itself in symbols because its deeper contents transcended the ego's conceptual categories. The unconscious did not speak in logical propositions, but in pictures, stories, and emotional resonances. The analyst's task was to help the patient understand this symbolic language, to translate the unconscious communications into terms that could be integrated into conscious awareness and lived experience. Crucially, Jung did not believe the analyst imposed meanings on symbolic material. Rather, the symbols themselves carried inherent meanings rooted in the archetypes of the collective unconscious. These archetypal patterns shaped human experience across cultures and historical periods. The hero's journey, the death and rebirth, the divine child, the wise old man, the terrible mother, these were not arbitrary constructs but deep structures of the psyche itself. When they appeared in dreams, myths, or fantasies, they brought with them a numinous quality, a sense of significance that gripped the individual. Jung's therapy involved helping patients recognize and consciously relate to these archetypal energies, neither identifying with them, which produced inflation, nor repressing them, which produced neurosis, but entering into a dialogue that fostered integration. Jung's method, then, was fundamentally hermeneutic. It involved interpretation, the search for meaning. But it was also experimental and experiential. He encouraged patients to engage in active imagination, a technique in which one deliberately focuses on unconscious images and allows them to unfold, interacting with the figures and scenes that emerge. He asked patients to paint, sculpt, and write, giving form to unconscious contents. He traced the parallels between personal symbols and mythological motifs, helping patients see their individual struggles as part of humanity's larger story. The goal was not simply symptom relief, but transformation, a fundamental shift in the structure and orientation of personality, a movement toward the self's realization. This brings us to Jung's understanding of wholeness, which was paradoxical and dialectical. True wholeness did not mean perfection or the elimination of darkness. Rather, it meant the integration of opposites, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, masculine and feminine, spiritual and instinctual. The self, as the archetype of wholeness, contained all contradictions. The mandala images that Jung studied from various mystical traditions represented this totality, a center that encompasses everything, a circle that excludes nothing. Individuation meant becoming more completely oneself by integrating all aspects of personality, including those that ego consciousness found unacceptable. Jung, therefore, had a nuanced view of pathology. Neurosis emerged when the conscious personality became too one-sided, when certain aspects of the total personality were split off and relegated to the shadow or the animus. These rejected contents did not simply disappear. They became autonomous complexes in the unconscious, interfering with conscious functioning and eventually demanding recognition. A man who identified entirely with rationality and control might find himself plagued by irrational moods and compulsive behaviors, the return of the repressed feeling and instinct. A woman who lived only through relationships with others might suffer a breakdown when those relationships failed, forced finally to encounter the autonomous self she had neglected. But Jung did not view this suffering as merely negative. The breakdown of an inadequate conscious attitude was often the psyche's way of forcing growth. The symptoms were compensatory, attempting to restore balance. If properly understood and worked with, they could lead to a more comprehensive and authentic way of being. Thus, Jung's approach to healing was not about returning the patient to a previous state of functioning, but about facilitating a movement forward into greater wholeness. The crisis was potentially a kairos, a moment pregnant with possibility for transformation. This therapeutic vision was inseparable from Jung's metaphysical commitments. He believed the psyche was real, not merely a epiphenomenon of brain processes, but a genuine dimension of existence with its own laws and dynamics. The archetypes were not reducible to neurological patterns or evolutionary adaptations, though they might correlate with these. They belonged to a psychoid realm that somehow participated in both matter and spirit. Jung's late work on synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that could not be explained by causal chains, reflected his conviction that psyche and world were not entirely separate, that consciousness participated in a larger order that transcended the subject-object split. For Jung, then, psychology necessarily opened onto metaphysics, spirituality, and the perennial questions of philosophy. Who am I? What is the meaning of my life? How should I live? What happens after death? What is the nature of ultimate reality? These were not questions that psychology could bracket or set aside. They were the very questions that animated psychological development. The human psyche was oriented toward meaning, and full psychological health required a meaningful relationship to something beyond the ego, whether understood as the self, the collective unconscious, God, or the cosmic order. Now let us turn to Goldstein's vision, which operated in a strikingly different register. When Goldstein looked at a patient, what did he see? He saw an organism attempting to maintain and enhance its functioning in the face of specific challenges or impairments. A soldier with a brain lesion was struggling to achieve ordered behavior with a compromised neural substrate. A neurotic patient was an organism caught in rigid, inadequate patterns of response that prevented effective coping. A healthy person was successfully actualizing capacities in achieving adequate mastery of their environment. Goldstein's case studies read like careful phenomenological descriptions of behavior and experience. He recounts how Schneider attempts to locate a spot on his arm, how he must move the arm before he can point to it, how this limitation affects his ability to perform various tasks, how he compensates through verbal and motor strategies. Goldstein describes the quality of the patient's experience, the concreteness, the stimulus-bound character, the loss of flexibility in adapting to varying contexts. But he stays close to what can be observed, described, and related to known facts about brain organization and function. This approach required what Goldstein called the phenomenological method, though he used this term somewhat differently than the philosophical phenomenologists like Husserl and Heidegger. For Goldstein, phenomenology meant describing the total situation of the patient without premature theoretical interpretation, attending to the qualitative character of experience and behavior, recognizing that symptoms must be understood in context rather than in isolation. It meant resisting the temptation to reduce the living organism to abstract mechanisms while still maintaining scientific rigor and empirical grounding. Goldstein did not deny the importance of subjective experience, but he approached it differently than Jung. He was interested in how the organism experiences its world, how space appears to the person with parietal damage, how tasks feel to someone whose abstract attitude is impaired, how anxiety arises when catastrophe threatens. But he understood these experiences as aspects of organismic functioning, not as messages from an unconscious realm or expressions of archetypal patterns. The felt quality of experience reflected the organism's current state of organization and its adequacy for dealing with environmental demands. Goldstein's method was thus descriptive and correlative, rather than hermeneutic. He did not seek hidden meanings beneath symptoms, but tried to understand how symptoms reflected the organism's total adaptive strategy. When a brain-injured patient developed peculiar behaviors, these were not symbolic communications, but functional responses to the altered capacities imposed by neural damage. When a neurotic person exhibited rigid patterns of behavior, this reflected not unconscious conflicts, but an organism that had narrowed its functioning to avoid catastrophic confrontation with demands it could not adequately meet. The concept of catastrophic reaction was central to Goldstein's understanding of anxiety and pathology. When the organism encountered situations that exceeded its capacity for ordered response, it experienced a state of shock and disorganization, trembling, perspiration, emotional upset, cognitive confusion, sometimes rage or withdrawal. The organism would go to great lengths to avoid such catastrophic experiences, even if this meant severely limiting its activities and living within a narrow, overly protected sphere. Neurosis, in Goldstein's view, often represented this defensive constriction, the organism protecting itself from potential catastrophe by rigidly excluding possibilities that might overwhelm it. But Goldstein was not a pessimist about human potential. Quite the opposite. He believed the fundamental tendency of the organism was toward self-realization, toward actualizing its capacities in interaction with the world. This was not a psychological drive alongside other drives, but the basic principle of organismic functioning. The organism did not seek merely to reduce tension or maintain homeostasis. It sought to express and develop its nature. A child did not learn to walk merely because of external rewards or internal pressures, but because walking represented an actualization of human potential. An artist did not create merely to discharge pent-up energy, but because creating was an expression of capacities seeking realization. This concept of self-realization sounds remarkably similar to Jung's individuation, and indeed, both terms point toward a process of becoming more fully oneself. But the differences are equally striking. For Goldstein, self-realization was not a symbolic or spiritual journey, but a biological process. It did not involve encountering archetypal figures or integrating shadow aspects. It meant the organism's capacities finding appropriate expression and development within the organism's actual possibilities and environmental circumstances. A brain-injured patient achieves self-realization not by integrating unconscious contents, but by developing compensatory strategies that allow optimal functioning within new constraints. Goldstein's understanding of wholeness was similarly biological and functional rather than metaphysical. The organism is a whole in the sense that all its parts and processes are integrated within a unified functioning system. You cannot understand any aspect in isolation because each aspect derives its meaning from its role in the total organization. Perception, movement, cognition, emotion, all these interpenetrate and mutually condition each other. When neurologists spoke of isolated functions, they were abstracting from the concrete reality of organismic functioning. Useful as such abstractions might be, they obscured the fundamental fact that the organism always operates as a whole. Pathology, then, represented not conflict between consciousness and unconscious, but disturbance of organismic wholeness. Brain damage, for instance, did not simply eliminate specific functions. It forced a reorganization of the entire system. The symptoms we observe represent both the direct effects of damage and the organism's attempts at compensation. A lesion in one area affects behavior not just through what is lost, but through how the whole organism responds to that loss. Similarly, functional disorders, like neurosis, represented not unconscious conflicts, but inadequate, rigid patterns of total organismic response that prevented effective engagement with environmental demands. Goldstein's view of healing followed from this understanding. Therapy should aim to help the organism achieve a more adequate, flexible mode of functioning. For brain-injured patients, this meant working with remaining capacities to develop compensatory strategies, reducing exposure to catastrophic situations, and helping the patient and family adjust expectations to realistic possibilities. For neurotic patients, it meant creating conditions that allowed the organism to risk expanding beyond its defensive constrictions, discovering that it could meet demands it had been avoiding, gradually achieving more complete self-realization. This therapeutic vision was practical and educational rather than transformative in Jung's sense. Goldstein did not aim to facilitate archetypal encounters or symbolic integration. He aimed to help organisms function more adequately within their actual circumstances. The goal was not a mystical wholeness transcending ordinary existence, but effective, ordered behavior that allowed the organism to express its capacities and engage meaningfully with its world. If this sometimes took on spiritual dimensions, if patients found meaning and fulfillment in their expanded functioning, this was a welcome result, but not the primary focus. Crucially, Goldstein rejected what he saw as metaphysical speculation. He did not deny the reality of consciousness or subjective experience, but he believed these could and should be understood as aspects of organismic functioning, not as separate mental substances or realms. The unconscious, in his view, was an unnecessary and misleading concept. What psychoanalysts attributed to unconscious processes could be better understood as unreflected aspects of total organismic functioning, or as the organism's holistic responses that exceeded what could be consciously articulated. There was no need to posit hidden mental contents or autonomous psychic figures. Similarly, Goldstein was skeptical of invoking purposes or meanings that transcended biological function. When he spoke of the organism striving toward self-realization, he did not mean this anthropomorphically or teleologically in a metaphysical sense. He meant that organismic functioning exhibited certain directional characteristics toward maintaining and enhancing organized activity, toward expressing capacities, toward adequate coping with environmental demands. This was observable biological reality, not mystical purpose. Any attempt to go beyond such descriptions, to posit cosmic meanings or spiritual dimensions, departed from legitimate scientific inquiry into metaphysical speculation. Here, then, we see the profound divergence between Jung and Goldstein. Both used the language of wholeness, both spoke of self-realization, both rejected purely mechanistic views of human beings. But Jung's psychology opened onto myth, symbol, and spirit, while Goldstein's remained resolutely within the bounds of biology, behavior, and phenomenological description. Jung believed the psyche contained autonomous transpersonal contents that communicated through symbols and demanded recognition. Goldstein believed the organism was a unified biological system whose functioning could be understood through careful observation and description without invoking hidden realms or metaphysical purposes. Yet, despite this divergence, there is something they share, something that draws them into constellation despite their methodological differences. Both resist reductionism. Both insist that human beings cannot be understood by breaking them down into isolated components and mechanisms. Both see development and growth as central to human existence rather than mere adjustment or symptom reduction. Both believe in the possibility of achieving a more complete, authentic mode of being. Let us explore this shared ground more carefully, for it reveals something essential. Rest now in this space between two visions. Feel how each thinker offers a different kind of light, illuminating different aspects of what it means to be human. Jung leads us into the depths, into dream and symbol, into the encounter with the eternal patterns that structure human experience. Goldstein leads us into the careful observation of living beings, into the description of how organisms actually function and strive, into the biological ground of our existence. Neither vision is complete alone. Together, they suggest something richer and more complex than either could capture individually. When Jung and Goldstein both spoke of holism, they were rebelling against the dominant paradigm of their era, the mechanistic, reductionistic approach that sought to explain complex phenomena by breaking them into simpler parts. This was the age of analysis, of dissection, of the conviction that understanding meant identifying basic building blocks and the laws governing their interaction. In physics, this approach had yielded spectacular success, leading to theories of matter and energy that could predict and control natural phenomena with unprecedented precision. In biology and medicine, it had led to the germ theory of disease, the understanding of cellular mechanisms, the mapping of neural pathways. In psychology, it manifested in associationism, behaviorism, and even in much of psychoanalysis, all attempting to reduce the complexity of mental life to simpler elements and principles. Both Jung and Goldstein recognized that something essential was lost in this reduction. A living human being was not merely a collection of reflexes, associations, or even instinctual drives. There was an organizing principle, a wholeness that could not be captured by summing up parts, but they located this wholeness in different dimensions and understood its nature differently. For Jung, the wholeness was psychic. The psyche was a self-regulating system with its own inherent organization. The various contents of consciousness, thoughts, feelings, sensations, intuitions were organized into a functioning whole by the ego. But the ego itself floated on the deeper ground of the unconscious. And the unconscious was not merely a repository of repressed material, but had its own structure, its own creative capacity, its own purposiveness. The archetypes provided a kind of deep structure, innate patterns that organized experience and gave it meaning. The self represented the totality and center, the organizing principle of the whole personality, which was far larger and more comprehensive than the conscious ego. This psychic wholeness was fundamentally mysterious. It could not be fully mapped or explained in causal terms. The psyche produced symbols, images, and intuitions that pointed toward realities beyond rational grasp. Dreams came from a source we did not control, bringing messages whose full meaning often remained opaque. Synchronicities revealed connections between psyche and world that defied mechanistic explanation. The numinous experiences that sometimes erupted in analysis testified to dimensions of reality transcending ordinary consciousness. Jung's holism thus had a mystical quality. The whole was not just greater than the sum of parts, but was something entirely different in kind, participating in what he called the psychoid realm, where matter and psyche inner and outer, somehow interpenetrated. Jung's therapeutic practice reflected this understanding. He did not simply address symptoms but engaged the whole person in their depth. He attended to dreams, fantasies, and associations, following where they led into mythological and spiritual territory. He worked with the transference not merely as distortion to be corrected, but as a vessel for transformation, an alchemical process in which both analyst and analysand were changed. He encouraged patients to paint, write, and engage in active imagination, giving form to unconscious contents. The goal was not simply to resolve conflicts, but to establish a relationship between ego and unconscious that allowed dialogue, integration, and the gradual unfolding of the self. This process was necessarily individual and unpredictable. Jung could identify common patterns, the stages of analysis, the typical archetypal figures encountered, the general movement from fragmentation toward integration, but each person's journey was unique. The self had its own timing, its own way of manifesting. The analyst's role was not to direct the process according to a predetermined program, but to facilitate it, to help the patient understand what the psyche was trying to communicate, to provide a stable container in which transformation could safely occur. This required the analyst to have undertaken their own individuation work, to have confronted their own shadow, and encountered the autonomous figures of their own unconscious. For Goldstein, the wholeness was biological and functional. The organism was an integrated system in which neural, physiological, and behavioral processes formed a unified functioning whole. You could not understand any aspect without reference to the total organization. Even something as apparently simple as a reflex could not be properly understood in isolation. Its character and manifestation depended on the state of the whole organism. When neurologists identified specific brain regions with specific functions, they were making useful abstractions, but the reality was that every region participated in multiple functions, and every function involved multiple regions in complex interaction. This biological wholeness was in principle comprehensible through careful observation and description. Goldstein did not invoke mysterious realms or hidden dimensions. The organism was right there, observable, describable, understandable in terms of its actual functioning. True, this functioning was complex, involving subtle interactions and emergent properties that could not be predicted by studying components in isolation, but it was still natural, biological, amenable to scientific investigation. The appropriate method was phenomenology, careful description of how the organism actually behaves and experiences, combined with neurological knowledge about brain organization and function. Goldstein's therapeutic practice reflected this understanding. He worked with patients to understand their actual capacities and limitations. For brain-injured soldiers, this meant detailed assessment of what functions remained intact and what was impaired, followed by practical training and compensatory strategies. A patient who could not perform abstract visual reasoning might be taught to use verbal mediation instead. A patient prone to catastrophic reactions might learn to structure their environment to reduce overwhelming demands. The goal was to help the organism achieve optimal functioning within its actual possibilities. For neurotic patients, the approach was similar in spirit, though different in detail. The therapist worked to understand what situations triggered catastrophic anxiety, what rigid patterns of behavior the patient used to avoid such situations, and how these defensive constrictions limited self-realization. Therapy created conditions in which the patient could risk trying new behaviors, discovering that they could manage situations they had been avoiding, gradually expanding the range of adequate functioning. This was educational and supportive, helping the organism develop new patterns of response rather than uncovering hidden contents. This process was less dramatic than Jungian analysis, but no less respectful of the individual. Goldstein recognized that each organism was unique, with its own particular strengths, limitations, and circumstances. There was no single standard of health or normality to which all should conform. Self-realization meant actualizing this particular organism's capacities, not conforming to an abstract ideal. A brain-injured patient who achieved stable, meaningful functioning within their limitations had realized themselves as fully as an intact person who achieved creative excellence. The measure was adequacy of functioning relative to actual possibilities, not comparison to external standards. The key difference, then, lies in what we might call the dimension of depth. Jung's holism opened downward and inward, into the depths of the unconscious, into the symbolic and archetypal dimensions that connected the individual to the eternal patterns of human experience. Goldstein's holism opened outward and laterally, into the complex interactions of organism and environment, into the observable patterns of functioning that revealed the organism's striving toward adequate performance. Jung asked what the psyche means, what it is trying to communicate, what symbolic and spiritual realities it points toward. Goldstein asked how the organism functions, what it is trying to achieve, what patterns of behavior reveal about organismic organization. Consider how each would approach a patient presenting with anxiety. Jung would explore the patient's dreams, looking for images and themes that might reveal what the unconscious was trying to communicate. He might ask about the patient's life situation and sense of meaning, wondering if the anxiety reflected an unlived life, a neglected aspect of personality trying to emerge. He might look for symbols in the patient's associations and fantasies, seeing if archetypal patterns were constellated. He might wonder if the anxiety represented the shadow pressing for recognition, or the self disrupting an inadequate conscious attitude. The therapeutic work would involve helping the patient understand these unconscious communications, enter into dialogue with the autonomous contents producing the anxiety, and perhaps undergo a transformation of their basic orientation to life. Goldstein would explore the situations that trigger the patient's anxiety, looking for patterns that revealed what demands the organism found overwhelming. He might observe that the patient became anxious in unstructured situations requiring flexible, creative responses, suggesting that some capacity for abstract attitude or spontaneous adaptation was impaired or underdeveloped. He might notice that the patient rigidly avoided certain activities or possibilities, indicating a defensive constriction designed to prevent catastrophic confrontation with inadequacy. The therapeutic work would involve helping the patient gradually expand their functioning, discovering through actual experience that they could manage situations they had been avoiding, developing new strategies for coping with demands, and achieving a more adequate, less constricted pattern of behavior. Both approaches might help the patient, but they work through entirely different mechanisms and are based on fundamentally different understandings of what anxiety is. For Jung, anxiety symptoms are meaningful communications from the psyche, requiring interpretation and integration. For Goldstein, they are organismic responses to inadequate mastery of environmental demands, requiring description and functional rehabilitation. Jung treats the psyche as a symbolic reality requiring hermeneutic understanding. Goldstein treats the organism as a biological reality requiring phenomenological description. Yet there is a curious convergence in their goals. When Jung speaks of the individuated person, he describes someone who has integrated conscious and unconscious, who lives in relationship with the self, who can draw on both ego consciousness and the deeper resources of the psyche, who has found a meaningful relationship to the eternal patterns of human existence. Such a person is more whole, more complete, more fully themselves. When Goldstein speaks of the self-realized organism, he describes someone who can adequately meet environmental demands, who functions flexibly and creatively, who actualizes their capacities, who has achieved ordered behavior that allows meaningful engagement with their world. Such a person is also more whole, more complete, more fully themselves. Are these the same achievement described in different languages? Or are they genuinely different states, one psycho-spiritual and the other biological functional? Perhaps the question itself reveals a dualism that both thinkers would reject. Jung insisted that psyche and body were not separate substances, but different aspects of a unified reality. Goldstein insisted that the organism was a psychophysical whole, in which mental and physical aspects were inseparable. Neither accepted the Cartesian split between mind and matter. Yet they approached the unity from opposite sides. Jung emphasizing the psychic dimension, Goldstein emphasizing the biological. We might imagine a dialogue between them, though it never actually occurred. Jung might say, "Your observations of organismic functioning are valuable, Dr. Goldstein, but they do not touch the deeper questions. When your patient Schneider lost the abstract attitude, he lost something more than a biological capacity. He lost access to the symbolic dimension, to the realm of meaning and imagination that makes us human. You describe his concreteness as if it were merely a functional limitation, but it represents a constriction of consciousness itself. And when you speak of self-realization, you describe it in biological terms, as if actualizing capacities were simply a matter of adequate performance. But true self-realization involves the encounter with the self, the integration of the personality around its deepest center, a process that necessarily has spiritual dimensions. Your approach remains on the surface, describing behaviors and functions, while ignoring the depths from which consciousness emerges. Goldstein might respond, "Your symbolic interpretations are elaborate and fascinating, Doctor." Jung, "But they are speculative constructs built on top of biological reality. When you speak of archetypes and the collective unconscious, you reify what are better understood as patterns of organismic functioning that have evolutionary significance. The hero's journey is not an eternal pattern in a psychoid realm, but a reflection of how organisms approach challenges and transformations. When you interpret a dream as a message from the unconscious, you attribute purpose and agency to what is better understood as the organism's total functioning expressing itself in the reduced and altered state of sleep. And when you speak of individuation, you describe what I would call self-realization, but clothed in mystical language that obscures rather than illuminates. Your approach inflates biological and psychological realities into metaphysical systems, confusing the description of phenomena with speculation about transcendent realms. Jung might reply, "But you cannot reduce the psyche to biology without losing what is most essential. When my patients encounter the self in dreams and visions, they experience something numinous, something that cannot be captured by descriptions of organismic functioning. This is not speculation, but empirical reality. The psyche presents itself as more than biological mechanism. The images, the symbols, The sense of meaning and purpose that emerge in analysis are not mere epiphenomena, but reveal the psyche's own nature. To bracket these dimensions in favor of purely functional description is to impoverish our understanding of human beings. Goldstein might respond, "I do not deny the importance of meaning and subjective experience, but these must be understood as aspects of organismic functioning, not as evidence of a separate psychic realm. When your patients experience something as numinous, this reflects the organism's total response to certain situations or images. An organismic state that includes emotional, cognitive, and physiological dimensions. To attribute this to archetypal energies or a collective unconscious is to mistake your theoretical constructs for observed reality. My approach may seem less dramatic than yours, but it has the virtue of staying close to what can actually be observed and described without importing metaphysical assumptions. This imagined dialogue reveals the fundamental impasse between them, but also something more interesting. Each is pointing to something the other's framework does not fully capture. Jung is pointing to the symbolic, meaningful, numinous dimensions of human experience that resist reduction to functional descriptions. Goldstein is pointing to the biological grounding and observable behavioral patterns that resist inflation into metaphysical systems. Both critiques have force. Perhaps human beings are precisely the beings in whom biology becomes symbolic, where organismic functioning opens onto meaning and spirit, where the functional and the numinous interpenetrate. Neither Jung's psychology nor Goldstein's organismic theory alone captures this paradoxical nature, but together they sketch its contours. Consider the phenomenon of healing itself. When a patient recovers, whether from neurosis, from depression, from the crisis precipitated by brain injury, what has occurred? Jung would point to the symbolic work, the dreams that guided the process, the archetypal encounters that transformed consciousness, the integration of previously split-off contents. The healing emerged from the depths, from the psyche's own compensatory wisdom, from the self-orchestrating the movement toward wholeness. The patient's ego underwent a decentering and recentering, no longer identified with a narrow conscious perspective, but in relationship. With the larger personality, Goldstein would point to the functional changes, the development of new behavioral strategies, the reorganization of the organism to achieve more adequate performance, the reduction of catastrophic anxiety as the patient learned to manage previously overwhelming demands. The healing emerged from the organism's inherent tendency towards self-realization, from the development of capacities that had been blocked or underdeveloped, from the achievement of more flexible, ordered patterns of functioning. The patient's total organismic state shifted from defensive constriction to more complete self-expression. Are these descriptions of different aspects of the same healing process, or of fundamentally different types of healing? A patient who experiences Jungian analysis might well show the functional improvements Goldstein describes: more flexible behavior, reduced anxiety, better coping with demands. A patient who undergoes Goldstein's organismic therapy might well experience the meaningful transformations Jung describes a sense of becoming more oneself, of finding purpose and direction, of achieving greater wholeness. The correlation suggests underlying unity despite conceptual divergence, yet there are cases that seem to favor one framework over the other. Consider a person experiencing a midlife crisis, successful in worldly terms but plagued by a sense of meaninglessness and depression. Jung's framework seems ideally suited to this situation. The patient is likely in the second half of life, when the tasks shift from ego building and achievement to reflection and integration. The depression may signal that the previously adequate conscious attitude has become insufficient, that unlived aspects of personality are demanding recognition, that the self is disrupting the ego's control in service of greater wholeness. Jungian analysis might explore the patient's dreams and fantasies, uncovering neglected dimensions, perhaps the feeling function in a thinking dominant person, or the spiritual dimension in someone who lived purely materialistically. The work would involve recognizing and integrating these aspects, undergoing a transformation of values and orientation, finding meaning in the second half of life's specific tasks. How would Goldstein approach such a case? He might acknowledge the patient's subjective sense of meaninglessness, but would focus on the organismic realities. Perhaps the patient had narrowed their functioning to a few areas: career, external achievement, neglecting other capacities and possibilities. The depression might reflect the organism's sense that it was not adequately realizing itself, that potentials remained unactualized. Therapy might involve helping the patient explore new activities and relationships, discovering capacities they had not developed, finding ways to express themselves more completely. The focus would be on expanding actual functioning rather than interpreting symbolic content. Both approaches might help the patient, but Jung seems to speak more directly to the specifically spiritual and existential dimensions of the crisis. The sense of meaninglessness, the questions about life's purpose, the intuition that something deeper must be found, these are not easily captured in Goldstein's functional language. Of course, Goldstein might argue that meaning is itself a function of adequate organismic functioning, that when the organism fully actualizes its capacities in meaningful engagement with the world, the sense of purpose naturally arises. But this seems to describe the result rather than address the source of the crisis. Conversely, consider Goldstein's patient Schneider or other cases of brain injury. Jung's framework seems less applicable here. The problems arise from specific neurological damage with observable effects on cognitive and perceptual capacities. The patient's difficulties are concrete and practical: the inability to point to body parts without moving them, the loss of abstract visual reasoning, the tendency to catastrophic reactions when confronted with tasks exceeding remaining capacities. Goldstein's careful description of how the organism attempts to cope with these limitations, his practical strategies for developing compensatory functions, his understanding of how to structure the environment to prevent catastrophic reactions, all this seems more relevant than exploring symbolic meanings or archetypal patterns. Yet might there also be a place for Jung's approach even here? When a person suffers catastrophic brain injury, they face a profound transformation of identity and possibility. Who am I now that I cannot do what I once could? What meaning can my life have within these new limitations? How do I integrate this traumatic change into my sense of self? These are not merely functional questions. They involve the person's relationship to their own existence, their wrestling with fate and limitation, their need to find meaning and purpose despite or perhaps through their injury. The dreams of brain-injured patients might well reveal archetypal patterns of death and rebirth, of the wounded healer, of transformation through suffering. Jung's framework could provide a way of understanding and working with these deeper dimensions of the experience. So perhaps neither approach is universally superior. Rather, they illuminate different aspects of human existence, each more applicable to certain situations and questions than others. Jung's depth psychology is particularly suited to questions of meaning, purpose, identity, and spiritual transformation. Goldstein's organismic theory is particularly suited to questions of function, adaptation, rehabilitation, and practical coping. A complete understanding of human beings might require both the functional and the symbolic, the biological and the spiritual, the description of how we function and the interpretation of what our experience means. This brings us to one of the deepest questions in psychology. What is the relationship between mind and body, between consciousness and brain, between the psychological and the physiological? Both Jung and Goldstein rejected simple dualism, but they resolved the mind-body problem differently. Jung emphasized the psyche's autonomy while acknowledging its connection to body. Goldstein emphasized the organism's unity while acknowledging the reality of conscious experience. Their different emphases reflect different starting points and lead to different implications. Jung approached the mind-body problem through the concept of the psychoid. This was his term for a level of reality that was neither purely psychic nor purely physical, but somehow prior to or underlying both. The archetypes, he suggested, existed in this psychoid realm. They were not simply psychological patterns nor simply neurological structures, but something that manifested in both domains. This allowed Jung to maintain the psyche's irreducibility while acknowledging its connection to body and world. The psychoid was a kind of unus mundus, a unified world in which mind and matter were not yet differentiated or were two aspects of a deeper unity. This conception had profound implications. It meant that consciousness could not be reduced to brain processes, though it was correlated with them. It meant that meaning and purpose were real dimensions of reality, not merely subjective projections onto a meaningless material world. It meant that synchronicities, meaningful coincidences between psychic states and physical events were possible, reflecting the deeper unity of the psychoid realm. Jung's position was thus a sophisticated form of dual-aspect monism, or perhaps neutral monism, in which psyche and matter were two aspects of a unified reality that transcended both. Goldstein approached the mind-body problem through the concept of the organism. The organism was a unified psychophysical entity in which mental and physical aspects were abstractions from the concrete reality of functioning. You could not have consciousness without a brain, but you also could not understand the brain without reference to the conscious experience and behavior it enables. The organism was prior to the distinction between mental and physical. It was the living unity from which both aspects could be distinguished analytically, but which existed as a whole. This conception also had profound implications, though different ones than Jung's. It meant that consciousness should be understood as an aspect of organismic functioning, not as a separate realm or substance. It meant that mental phenomena should be studied through their role in the organism's total adaptive functioning, not treated as autonomous realities. It meant that the organism was the fundamental unit of analysis, not the brain alone or the mind alone. Goldstein's position was thus a form of embodied or organismic monism, emphasizing the functional unity of the living being. The practical differences emerge when we consider phenomena that seem to challenge physicalist reduction. Consider a mystical experience. A patient has a vision, encounters what seems to be a divine presence, feels overwhelming awe and unity, and is transformed by the experience. How do we understand this? Jung would take the experience seriously as a psychological reality. The patient has encountered something real in the psyche, whether we call it the self, an archetype, or the numinous dimension of existence. The experience has its own validity and meaning, independent of its neurological correlates. We might study what brain states accompany such experiences, but the experience itself cannot be reduced to those brain states. The vision, the sense of presence, the transformative meaning, these are psychological realities that must be understood on their own terms. Jung would explore the symbolic content of the vision, its relationship to the patient's individuation process, its connections to mythological and religious patterns, its implications for the patient's ongoing development. Goldstein would also take the experience seriously, but would understand it differently. The mystical state represents a particular mode of organismic functioning, a holistic, integrated state in which the usual distinction between self and world, subject and object, becomes less prominent. This is a real experience with real effects, but it should be understood as an organismic state with neurological, physiological, psychological, and behavioral dimensions all integrated within total functioning. We might study the brain states involved, the physiological changes, the behavioral effects, the subjective reports, all as aspects of the total organismic event. Goldstein would focus on how such experiences affect the patient's subsequent functioning, whether they lead to more adequate self-realization or perhaps to difficulties in everyday coping. Neither approach denies the reality of the experience, but they frame its significance differently. For Jung, the mystical experience reveals something about the nature of the psyche, and perhaps about the nature of reality itself, the existence of transpersonal dimensions, the reality of the numinous, the possibility of consciousness transcending ego boundaries. For Goldstein, it reveals something about the possibilities of organismic functioning, the capacity for holistic states that transcend ordinary subject-object consciousness, the organism's potential for experiences that profoundly affect its subsequent functioning. As you rest in contemplation of these two perspectives, notice how each offers a kind of shelter, a framework for understanding experience. Jung's framework shelters the soul, providing categories for spiritual experience, validating the search for meaning, honoring the mysterious depths of consciousness. Goldstein's framework shelters the organism, providing categories for functional understanding, validating practical coping and adaptation, honoring the biological ground of existence. Both are needed. Human beings are precisely those organisms whose functioning opens onto symbol and spirit, whose biology enables consciousness that seeks meaning and transcendence. Let us explore more deeply how their different starting points led to different understandings of key psychological phenomena. Consider the question of motivation, what drives human behavior and development. This is among the most fundamental questions in psychology, and Jung and Goldstein answered it quite differently. For Jung, human motivation could not be understood purely in terms of instinctual drives or the pleasure principle. While he acknowledged the importance of basic drives, sexuality, aggression, hunger, he believed these were manifestations of a more fundamental energy he called libido. This was not simply sexual energy as Freud conceived it, but vital energy in general, the basic life force that took different forms depending on what Jung called the principle of equivalence. When energy was withdrawn from one area of life, it appeared in another. When conscious attitudes became one-sided, energy constellated in the unconscious, forming complexes or activating archetypal patterns. But more important than the energy itself was its teleology, its direction and purpose. Jung believed the psyche was oriented toward a goal, and that goal was individuation, the realization of the self, the achievement of wholeness. This was not simply a conscious intention, but a built-in tendency of the psyche itself. The self, as both the center and totality of personality, was the goal toward which development tended. When life proceeded in ways contrary to individuation, when the ego became too inflated, or when important aspects of personality were neglected, the psyche rebelled. Neurotic symptoms, dreams, and fantasies all represented the psyche's attempt to restore balance and redirect energy toward wholeness. This teleological view meant that psychological difficulties often had a positive purpose. A neurosis that brought someone's life to a halt might be forcing a necessary transformation. A depression that undermined previous values might be preparing the ground for new meanings to emerge. The psyche knew what it needed, even when the conscious ego did not. The task of analysis was not to impose the analyst's will, but to help the patient understand and cooperate with the psyche's own movement toward wholeness. Jung was careful to distinguish this teleological view from either mechanical causation or metaphysical determinism. He did not believe the future was predetermined or that development followed a fixed path. Rather, the psyche possessed what he called prospective functions, the capacity to anticipate, to try out possibilities, to orient toward potential futures. Dreams often had a prospective character, pointing not just to the past but to where the psyche was trying to go. The self was not a static entity, but an ideal of wholeness that could never be fully achieved yet nonetheless organized development. This view of motivation was deeply connected to Jung's understanding of archetypes. The archetypes were not simply images, but patterns of behavior and development with their own energy. When an archetype was constellated, it seized the personality with a kind of compulsive force. A person in the grip of the hero archetype might feel compelled to pursue challenges and adventures, regardless of personal cost. A person identifying with the Great Mother might devote themselves entirely to nurturing others while neglecting their own needs. The task was not to eliminate archetypal influence, but to consciously relate to it, neither identifying with the archetype, inflation, nor being possessed by it unconsciously. Archetypic dominance. But maintaining a creative tension between ego and archetype that allowed the energy to serve individuation. Goldstein's view of motivation was very different. He rejected the model of separate drives, each seeking satisfaction. Instead, he proposed that there was one fundamental tendency of the organism, self-realization. This was not a drive among other drives, but the basic principle of organismic functioning. The organism strove to actualize its capacities, to achieve adequate performance, to realize its nature. All specific behaviors and goals could be understood as expressions of this fundamental tendency in particular circumstances. This sounded similar to Jung's individuation, but Goldstein meant something quite different. Self-realization was not a teleological principle pointing toward a spiritual goal, but a description of how organisms actually function. Living things do not simply respond passively to stimuli or seek merely to reduce tension. They actively engage with their environments, developing and expressing capacities. A seed grows into a plant not because it has a mental representation of its goal, but because growth and development are inherent in its nature. A child learns to walk not because of external rewards, but because walking represents an actualization of human potential. An artist creates not to discharge instinctual energy, but because creating expresses and develops artistic capacity. Goldstein was careful to distinguish self-realization from self-preservation. Self-preservation might sometimes require limiting activities and withdrawing from challenges. Self-realization, by contrast, required engaging with the environment, taking risks, expressing capacities, even when this created tension or danger. The organism did not seek merely to survive, but to live as fully as possible within its circumstances. Of course, when catastrophic threat emerged, the organism might defensively constrict, but this was a failure of self-realization, not its fulfillment. This view of motivation was deeply connected to Goldstein's holism. Self-realization was not one motive among others, but the organizing principle of the whole organism. Every specific action derived its meaning from its role in the organism's total striving toward adequate functioning. You cannot understand eating, for example, simply as the satisfaction of hunger drive. Rather, eating was part of the organism's total pattern of maintaining and enhancing itself. Its meaning varied depending on context. Eating to restore depleted energy was different from eating as social activity, which was different from eating as neurotic compensation. Goldstein did not invoke purposes or goals beyond what could be observed in organismic functioning. When he spoke of the organism striving towards self-realization, this was shorthand for observable directional characteristics in behavior tendencies toward growth, development, mastery, and adequate performance. These were biological realities that did not require explaining through metaphysical principles or psychological purposes. The organism's nature was to function in these ways. Why? Goldstein might say this is simply what organisms are. The question, why, seeks a metaphysical answer where biological description suffices. Consider how these different views of motivation would affect therapeutic practice. A patient comes to Jung complaining that they feel stuck, unable to move forward in life, plagued by indecision and anxiety. Jung would explore the patient's dreams and fantasies, looking for clues about what the psyche was trying to communicate. Perhaps the dreams showed the patient repeatedly encountering closed doors or blocked paths. Jung might wonder what aspect of personality the patient was blocking, what unlived potential was trying to emerge. Perhaps the patient had been living entirely in the thinking function, neglecting feeling, and the psyche was now demanding recognition of the feeling side. Or perhaps the patient was identified with persona, living inauthentically according to others' expectations, and the self was disrupting this false adaptation to force a more genuine life. The work would involve helping the patient understand these unconscious communications, recognize what was trying to emerge, and undertake the difficult process of integrating previously neglected aspects of personality. The same patient comes to Goldstein with the same complaints. Goldstein would explore the patient's actual functioning. What specifically can the patient not do? What situations trigger the anxiety and indecision? What patterns emerge in the patient's behavior? Perhaps Goldstein discovers that the patient functions adequately in structured, familiar situations, but becomes anxious and indecisive when faced with unstructured choices or ambiguous possibilities. This suggests a limitation in what Goldstein called the abstract attitude, the capacity to consider hypotheticals, to see possibilities rather than only concrete actualities. The patient has organized their life defensively to avoid situations requiring this capacity. The work would involve gradually helping the patient develop more flexibility, exposing them carefully to situations that require abstract thinking, supporting them as they discover they can manage demands they had been avoiding, expanding the range of adequate functioning. Both approaches might help, but they conceptualize the problem differently. Jung sees the patient as blocked in their individuation process, with the psyche itself demanding change. Goldstein sees the patient as an organism with limited and rigid functioning, defensively avoiding catastrophic confrontation with inadequacy. Jung focuses on symbolic content and meaning. Goldstein focuses on observable patterns of functioning and their contexts. Jung works toward transformation through integration of unconscious contents. Goldstein works toward rehabilitation through development of new functional capacities. Or consider the phenomenon of creativity. How do we understand the creative process, the emergence of something genuinely new? For Jung, creativity emerged from the unconscious. The artist or thinker was someone who could access and give form to unconscious contents, particularly archetypal contents from the collective unconscious. The creative process was not entirely under conscious control. Rather, the ego cooperated with something that emerged from the depths. Jung distinguished between psychological art, which drew on the artist's personal complexes and experiences, and visionary art, which drew on the collective unconscious and expressed archetypal patterns that transcended the personal. The greatest art and literature, he believed, gave form to the eternal patterns of human experience, allowing individuals to connect with the collective psyche. Jung himself experienced this in his own work. During his confrontation with the unconscious, images and figures emerged that he did not consciously create, but that presented themselves to him. He gave them form through writing and painting in the Red Book. Later, his theoretical works often emerged from intuitions and visions that he then worked to articulate conceptually. He saw his own creativity as a collaboration between ego and unconscious, between conscious understanding and deeper sources of knowing. For Goldstein, creativity represented the organism functioning at its most adequate, fully expressing and developing its capacities. The creative person was not accessing a mysterious unconscious realm, but achieving optimal organismic functioning in which various capacities, perceptual, cognitive, emotional, motor, were fully integrated and expressed. The creative process involved the organism encountering situations for which established patterns were inadequate, forcing a reorganization that produced something new. The novelty emerged not from hidden depths, but from the organism's capacity to go beyond established patterns when circumstances demanded or allowed it. Goldstein would be skeptical of attributing creativity to unconscious sources. What Jung called the unconscious was better understood as the unreflective aspects of total organismic functioning, the holistic processes that exceed what consciousness can explicitly articulate. When a creative insight suddenly emerges, this reflects not a message from an unconscious realm, but the organism's total processing of a problem at levels that precede conscious articulation. The subsequent conscious formulation is one aspect of a total organismic event that includes many unthematized dimensions. Both views capture something true. Jung's framework honors the sense that creative inspiration comes from beyond the ego, that genuine creativity involves cooperating with something larger than personal will, that the greatest creative works connect us to archetypal patterns of human experience. Goldstein's framework honors the concrete processes of creative work, the perceptual engagement, the cognitive effort, the motor skills, the whole organism's focused activity, and avoids mystifying creativity by attributing it to hidden realms. Perhaps creativity requires both dimensions. The creative person must have access to sources beyond narrow ego consciousness, whether we call these the collective unconscious or the organism's total functioning, and the creative person must be able to give form to what emerges, which requires developed capacities and disciplined work. The poet must be open to inspiration, but must also master language. The scientist must be open to intuitions, but must also develop rigorous methods. The creative process is both receptive and active, both discovery and construction, both found and made. As you drift between waking and sleeping, Consider how these two ways of understanding might both be necessary. Jung invites us into the depths, into the symbolic and mythic dimensions where meaning dwells. Goldstein invites us into the careful observation of how we actually function, into the biological ground of consciousness. Together, they sketch the paradoxical nature of human existence. We are organisms whose functioning opens onto symbol and spirit, biological beings capable of encountering the numinous, material creatures who seek transcendent meaning. Let us turn now to the question of pathology and healing. This is where the practical consequences of their different frameworks become most apparent. How do we understand psychological disturbance, and what does healing require? Jung's view of pathology was fundamentally about imbalance and dissociation. Neurosis occurred when the conscious personality became too one-sided, when certain aspects of the total personality were split off and relegated to the shadow, the anima, animus, or other unconscious complexes. The conscious ego, identifying with certain traits and functions while disowning others, created an artificial unity that excluded too much. The dissociated contents did not simply disappear, but became autonomous, interfering with conscious functioning and eventually demanding recognition through symptoms. Consider a man who identifies entirely with rationality, control, and achievement, the typical persona of the successful professional. He disowns his feeling side, his vulnerability, his need for relationship and meaning beyond accomplishment. These neglected aspects accumulate in the shadow and anima. Eventually, symptoms emerge. Perhaps he becomes depressed, finding no satisfaction in his achievements. Perhaps he has irrational mood swings that disrupt his prized rationality. Perhaps he develops psychosomatic symptoms that force him to confront the body and feeling he has neglected. The symptoms are compensatory, the psyche's attempt to restore balance by forcing attention to what has been excluded. The neuroses might also have a teleological dimension. Perhaps this man is in the second half of life, when the tasks shift from ego building to integration, from external achievement to inner meaning. His depression is not simply a breakdown, but a potential breakthrough, the psyche dismantling an inadequate conscious attitude to make space for something more complete. If he can understand the symbolic meaning of his symptoms, if he can encounter and integrate the shadow and anima figures in his dreams and fantasies, if he can undergo the transformation the self is orchestrating, he might emerge more whole, more authentic, more fully individuated. This view had profound implications for therapy. The therapist was not trying to eliminate symptoms or return the patient to normal functioning. The therapist was facilitating a developmental process, helping the patient understand what the psyche was trying to communicate, supporting the integration of previously unconscious contents, and accompanying the patient through the often difficult and frightening process of transformation. This required the therapist to have undergone their own individuation work, to have confronted their own shadow and established relationship with their own self. The therapeutic relationship itself became a container for transformation, with transference and countertransference understood as alchemical processes in which both patient and therapist were potentially changed. Jung was also deeply aware of the limits of therapy. Some people were not ready for individuation work. Some disturbances were too severe, requiring more supportive or even custodial care. Some symptoms served necessary defensive functions and should not be prematurely challenged. The therapist had to discern where the patient was in their development and what they were capable of undertaking. Not everyone needed or could benefit from depth analysis. For some, support in adapting to life's demands was more appropriate. But for those who were ready, those who felt the call to individuation, analysis offered the possibility of profound transformation. Goldstein's view of pathology was fundamentally about disruption of organismic wholeness and the defensive responses to such disruption. Pathology occurred when the organism's capacity for self-realization was blocked, when functioning became rigid and inadequate, when the organism could not achieve ordered behavior adequate to its situation. This might result from biological damage, as in brain injury, or from developmental failures, or from overwhelming environmental demands, or from defensive constrictions designed to avoid catastrophe. Consider a patient who became anxious and avoidant, limiting their activities and social contacts, unable to function independently. Goldstein would investigate what demands triggered catastrophic reactions. Perhaps the patient had difficulty with unstructured situations, with tasks requiring spontaneous adaptation and flexible problem-solving. Perhaps certain social situations overwhelmed them. The rigidity and avoidance represented the organism's defense against potential catastrophe. By limiting functioning to predictable, structured situations, the patient avoided the panic and disorganization that emerged when demands exceeded capacity. The pathology, then, was not conflict between consciousness and unconscious, but inadequate, constricted organismic functioning. The patient had organized their life defensively, sacrificing self-realization to avoid catastrophe. The symptoms were not meaningful communications, but functional consequences of this defensive organization. Anxiety emerged at the boundaries of the patient's limited functioning, warning against expansion that might produce catastrophe. This view also had profound implications for therapy. The therapist worked to expand the patient's functioning gradually, creating conditions in which the patient could safely encounter demands they had been avoiding. This was educational and supportive, helping the patient develop new strategies, discover capacities they did not know they had, risk trying behaviors they had feared. The goal was not transformation through integration of unconscious contents, but rehabilitation through development of more adequate, flexible, complete functioning. Success meant the patient could actualize more of their capacities, engage more fully with their world, achieve greater self-realization within their actual possibilities. Goldstein was also aware of limitations. Some impairments were permanent, as with severe brain injury. Here, the goal was not to restore previous functioning, but to help the organism achieve the best adaptation possible within new constraints. This meant developing compensatory strategies, restructuring the environment to reduce overwhelming demands, helping patient and family adjust expectations. It also meant respecting the organism's defensive constrictions when these served necessary protective functions. Forcing expansion before the organism was ready could produce catastrophic reactions that worsened functioning rather than improving it. The practical differences are striking. Jung's patient works with dreams, active imagination, and symbolic exploration, seeking to integrate unconscious contents and undergo transformation. Goldstein's patient practices new behaviors, develops compensatory strategies, and gradually expands the range of adequate functioning. Jung's therapy is hermeneutic and transformative. Goldstein's is phenomenological and rehabilitative. Jung focuses on meaning and spiritual development. Goldstein focuses on function and adaptive capacity. Yet there are also unexpected similarities. Both rejected the medical model that saw symptoms as diseases to be eliminated through expert intervention. Both emphasize the patient's own resources and capacity for growth. Jung believed in the psyche's inherent wisdom and self-regulating capacity. Goldstein believed in the organism's inherent tendency towards self-realization. Both saw the therapist's role as facilitating a process rather than imposing solutions. Both understood that healing often required the patient to face what they had been avoiding for Jung, unconscious contents. For Goldstein, overwhelming demands, with a therapist providing support for this difficult confrontation. There is something deeply convergent in their views despite the theoretical divergence. Both see the human being as capable of more than current functioning exhibits. Both understand symptoms as representing some form of blockage or constriction of potential. Both believe that healing involves expanding and integrating for Jung, integrating conscious and unconscious. For Goldstein, expanding from constricted to more complete functioning. Both think transformation is possible and that the human being has resources for healing that can be activated with proper support. Perhaps we can imagine cases where both frameworks would be needed. Consider a person who suffers a traumatic brain injury. The immediate work, as Goldstein outlined, involves neurological assessment, understanding what capacities remain intact and what is impaired, developing compensatory strategies, restructuring the environment, preventing catastrophic reactions, and supporting the patient and family through the rehabilitation process. This is crucial practical work that cannot be replaced by symbolic interpretation. But as rehabilitation progresses, the patient must also come to terms with the existential and spiritual dimensions of what has happened. Who am I now? What is the meaning of my life, given these limitations? How do I integrate this catastrophic change into my sense of self? The patient's dreams might contain powerful archetypal imagery, death and rebirth, descent to the underworld, the wounded healer, transformation through suffering. Working with these symbolic dimensions, as Jung taught, might help the patient find meaning in their experience, connect to the deeper patterns of human suffering and transformation, and achieve psychological integration of what has occurred. The functional rehabilitation and the symbolic integration are both necessary. Neither alone suffices. Or consider a person experiencing a midlife crisis with no obvious neurological impairment. Jung's framework seems primarily relevant. The shift from first to second half of life, the breakdown of an inadequate conscious attitude, the call to individuation, the emergence of unlived aspects of personality. But might Goldstein's perspective also contribute something? Perhaps the person has indeed limited their functioning, developed in some capacities while neglecting others, organized their life around certain abilities while avoiding situations that would require different ones. The crisis might be understood both as the psyche demanding wholeness and as the organism sensing that its self-realization is incomplete. The work might involve both symbolic exploration of dreams and active development of neglected capacities, both Jung's integration of unconscious contents and Goldstein's expansion of adequate functioning. The synthesis of their perspectives suggests that human beings are complex realities requiring multiple levels of understanding. We are organisms with neurological structures and biological functioning, Goldstein's domain. We are also meaning-seeking beings whose consciousness opens onto symbolic and spiritual dimensions, Jung's domain. Complete healing addresses both levels, though different cases might emphasize different dimensions. Drift now into deeper rest, letting these ideas settle into your being. Feel how each perspective offers something necessary, something we cannot do without. Goldstein grounds us in biological reality, in the observable patterns of functioning, in the practical work of rehabilitation and adaptation. Jung opens us to depth and meaning, to the symbolic patterns that connect us to the eternal dimensions of human experience, to the possibility of transformation. Together, they remind us that we are embodied spirits, biological beings, capable of encountering the numinous organisms whose functioning mysteriously opens onto meaning and transcendence. We are approaching now the final movements of our exploration, the reflective synthesis where we can contemplate what this dialogue between Jung and Goldstein reveals about the human condition. But before we turn to that lyrical conclusion, let us consider one more crucial area of comparison, their understanding of consciousness itself. What is consciousness? This is perhaps the most profound question in psychology and philosophy, one that has challenged thinkers for millennia. How does subjective experience arise? What is the relationship between consciousness and the physical world? Can consciousness be explained, or does it remain irreducibly mysterious? Jung and Goldstein approach these questions from their characteristic perspectives, and their different answers illuminate yet another dimension of their divergence and convergence. For Jung, consciousness was the lit portion of a vast darkness. The ego was the center of consciousness, the I that experiences itself as a subject perceiving objects. But this conscious ego floated on an immense unconscious ground. The personal unconscious contained memories, feelings, and complexes that could potentially become conscious. Below that lay the collective unconscious, containing the archetypes, patterns of image and behavior inherited by all humanity. And perhaps deeper still was the psychoid realm, where psyche and matter were not yet differentiated. Consciousness, in Jung's view, arose from this unconscious ground and remained in constant dialogue with it. The unconscious was not simply the absence of consciousness, but had its own reality, its own creativity, its own purposiveness. Dreams, fantasies, and creative inspirations emerged from the unconscious, presenting contents to consciousness that the ego had not deliberately produced. Sometimes these contents were incomprehensible to the ego, requiring interpretation. Sometimes they had a numinous quality, seeming to come from a source greater than personal psychology. Jung believed consciousness had evolved relatively recently in human history and remained a fragile achievement, constantly threatened by regression into unconsciousness. The development of ego consciousness was one of humanity's great accomplishments, allowing reflective awareness, deliberate action, and rational thought. But this achievement came at a cost, the necessary splitting of the original unity of consciousness and unconscious, the creation of opposites that must then be reconciled. Individuation meant neither remaining unconscious nor becoming hyperconscious, but achieving a living relationship between ego and unconscious, between consciousness and its ground. Crucially, Jung did not think consciousness could be reduced to brain processes. While he acknowledged that consciousness correlated with brain functioning, he believed the psyche had its own reality that could not be explained away as merely an epiphenomenon of neurology. The contents of consciousness, the symbols, meanings, and feelings we experience belong to the psychological realm and must be understood psychologically, not reduced to physical causation. When the self appeared in dreams and visions, this was not merely neurons firing, but a genuine psychological reality, an autonomous contents making itself known to consciousness. This view located Jung in a long tradition of idealist and dualist philosophy that insisted on the irreducibility of consciousness and meaning. For Jung, the psyche was real, consciousness was real. The unconscious was real, all in their own right, not merely as byproducts of material processes. His psychology was thus fundamentally phenomenological in the sense of taking subjective experience seriously as primary data that could not be eliminated or reduced. Goldstein approached consciousness very differently. For him, consciousness was an aspect of organismic functioning, specifically the aspect in which the organism reflects on its own activity. Consciousness emerged when the organism needed to make adjustments, when automatic functioning was insufficient, when novel or problematic situations required attention. It was not a separate realm or substance, but a mode of organismic organization, a way the organism related to itself and its world. This view emerged from Goldstein's work with brain-injured patients, where he could observe how damage to specific brain regions affected consciousness in specific ways. Damage to sensory areas altered perceptual consciousness. Damage to frontal regions affected reflective consciousness and abstract thinking. Damage to parietal regions altered bodily consciousness and spatial awareness. These correlations suggested that consciousness was intimately tied to brain functioning, not separable from neurological processes. But Goldstein was not a reductionist. He did not claim that consciousness was nothing but neural activity. Rather, consciousness was a psychophysical phenomenon, an aspect of the total organism's functioning that had both subjective and objective dimensions. When we describe consciousness subjectively, from the first-person perspective, we describe the organism's experience of its own functioning. When we describe it objectively, from the third-person perspective, we describe neural and behavioral correlates. These are two ways of apprehending the same organismic reality, not two separate things. Goldstein was skeptical of positing unconscious contents or processes. What others call the unconscious, he understood as unreflected aspects of total organismic functioning. The organism functioned as a whole, including many processes that did not rise to reflective awareness. But this did not mean these processes existed in a separate, unconscious realm with its own contents and dynamics. It simply meant that consciousness was selective, attending to some aspects of functioning while others remained unthematized. This view located Goldstein in a tradition of naturalistic monism that sought to overcome mind-body dualism by understanding mental phenomena as aspects of biological organization. For Goldstein, consciousness was real but not separate from body. It was how the organism experienced its own functioning from within. There was no ghost in the machine, no immaterial soul, no psychoid realm. There was the organism, a unified psychophysical system whose functioning included what we call consciousness. These different views of consciousness led to different attitudes toward phenomena that seemed to transcend ordinary awareness. Consider mystical experiences, synchronicities, or intuitions that proved accurate without conscious reasoning. For Jung, these phenomena suggested that consciousness could access sources of knowledge beyond sensory perception and logical inference. Perhaps in mystical states, consciousness encountered the self or even the unus mundus. Perhaps synchronicities revealed the psychoid realm's unity. Perhaps intuitions drew on the collective unconscious's wisdom. These were possibilities to be taken seriously, evidence that consciousness participated in dimensions of reality not captured by materialist assumptions. For Goldstein, such phenomena required naturalistic explanation. Mystical experiences represented particular modes of organismic functioning, holistic states in which the usual subject-object distinction diminished. These were real experiences with real effects, but they reflected capacities of the organism, not encounters with transcendent realms. Synchronicities were likely coincidences noticed because of their emotional significance. Our tendency to find patterns sometimes produces false positives. Intuitions drew on the organism's total processing of available information, including unthematized perceptual and cognitive processing. The sudden insight represented the conscious thematization of what the organism had already processed holistically. Neither explanation is fully satisfying. Jung's openness to transcendent dimensions honors the phenomenology of such experiences. They feel like encounters with something beyond the personal ego, but risks making psychological work dependent on metaphysical assumptions that some find ungrounded. Goldstein's naturalistic explanations maintain scientific respectability, but risk explaining away dimensions of experience that seem irreducible to biological function. Perhaps the truth lies in recognizing that we do not yet fully understand consciousness, that it remains genuinely mysterious despite scientific advances. The hard problem of consciousness, why subjective experience exists at all, why there is something it is like to be conscious, has not been solved by neuroscience. We can correlate brain states with conscious experiences, but correlation is not explanation. We do not know why these particular neural patterns produce these particular experiential qualities. In this space of mystery, both Jung's and Goldstein's approaches have merit. Jung's insistence that consciousness must be understood on its own terms, that subjective experience is primary data, not reducible to objective description, protects something essential about human existence. Goldstein's insistence that consciousness be studied in relation to brain and behavior, that we not multiply metaphysical entities beyond necessity, maintains scientific discipline. Perhaps consciousness is indeed a psychophysical phenomenon, an aspect of organismic functioning, yet one that opens onto dimensions of meaning and possibly transcendence that purely functional description cannot capture. As we drift towards sleep, consider how consciousness itself remains mysterious, how you who are listening to these words are present to yourself in ways that exceed any description, how your awareness floats on depths you do not understand. Jung and Goldstein both gazed into this mystery, each seeing something true, neither seeing everything. In their dialogue, we glimpse the paradox of consciousness. It is both natural and mysterious, both biological and transcendent, both explicable and irreducible. Let us gather now these various threads into a final reflection, a lyrical meditation on what this dialogue reveals about the human condition, about the possibilities and limits of psychological understanding, about the eternal questions their work continues to illuminate. In the beginning, we posed a question. Are Jung and Goldstein describing the same reality in different languages, or are they addressing fundamentally different dimensions of human existence? Having traced their ideas through multiple domains, holism and fragmentation, self-realization and individuation, pathology and healing, consciousness and the unconscious, we can perhaps venture an answer, or at least a deeper articulation of the question itself. They describe overlapping realities using different conceptual frameworks, each framework illuminating aspects the other obscures. Human beings are complex enough, mysterious enough, multi-dimensional enough, that no single framework can capture everything. We need multiple perspectives, multiple languages, multiple ways of approaching the question of what we are. From Goldstein's perspective, we are organisms' unified biological systems, striving toward self-realization, toward actualizing our capacities in adaptive engagement with our environments. We are embodied, situated, in concrete circumstances, constrained by biology and neurology, understandable through careful observation and description. Our consciousness is an aspect of organismic functioning. Our growth is the expansion of adequate performance. Our healing is the rehabilitation of function. This perspective grounds us, connects us to the natural world, provides practical methods for addressing dysfunction. From Jung's perspective, we are souls on a journey of individuation, consciousness, emerging from and relating to unconscious depths, ego confronting shadow and anima, the personality seeking wholeness through integration of opposites, the self orchestrating transformation through symbol and myth. We are meaning-seeking beings, connected to eternal archetypal patterns, capable of numinous experience, understandable through interpretation of symbols and myths. Our consciousness participates in mystery. Our growth is transformation of personality. Our healing is integration of unconscious contents. This perspective elevates us, connects us to the spiritual dimensions of existence, provides language for our deepest yearnings. Both perspectives are needed because human beings are precisely those organisms whose functioning mysteriously opens onto meaning and spirit. We are biological. Yes, we have brains. We have bodies. We function or malfunction in ways that can be observed and described. But we are also symbolic, mythic, spiritual. We create meaning. We tell stories. We seek transcendence. We experience awe and wonder. Any psychology that honors only one dimension impoverishes our understanding. The dialogue between Jung and Goldstein thus reveals something essential, the necessity of multiple perspectives. We cannot reduce psyche to biology without losing what matters most about human existence. But we cannot inflate psychological experience into pure spirit without losing our grounding in embodied reality. We must maintain the tension between these perspectives, using each to correct the excesses of the other. Goldstein's organismic perspective corrects Jung's tendency toward metaphysical speculation. When Jung interprets every symbol as revealing eternal truths, when he finds archetypes everywhere, when he treats dreams as pronouncements from the self, Goldstein reminds us, these are organismic phenomena, expressions of a biological creature attempting to function adequately. The symbols and meanings we experience arise from a brain, correlate with neural processes, serve functional purposes in the organism's total adaptation. This does not make them illusory, but it grounds them in natural reality. Jung's depth psychology corrects Goldstein's tendency toward flattening experience into mere function. When Goldstein describes everything in terms of adequate performance and self-realization, when he reduces anxiety to catastrophic reaction, when he treats meaning as simply one aspect of organismic functioning, Jung reminds us human consciousness seeks something more than adequate adaptation. We yearn for meaning, for connection to something transcendent, for transformation of our being. The symbols, myths, and spiritual experiences that arise in the depths are not merely functional but revelatory, not merely biological but numinous. In their creative tension, these perspectives suggest that human beings exist in a paradoxical middle realm. We are neither purely biological organisms nor purely spiritual souls, but something that transcends both categories. We are biological beings whose very biology enables consciousness that seeks transcendent meaning. We are meaning-seeking beings whose search for meaning is grounded in biological structures and processes. The separation between biology and spirit, between function and meaning, between organism and soul is itself a construction that may not reflect the underlying unity of human existence. This paradoxical nature explains why different psychological approaches work for different people and problems. Some individuals and situations require Goldstein's approach, practical, functional, focused on observable behavior and adaptive capacity. Brain injuries, specific skill deficits, concrete adaptive problems benefit from organismic understanding and rehabilitation methods. Other individuals and situations require Jung's approach, symbolic, transformative, focused on meaning and spiritual development. Existential crises, midlife transitions, the search for authentic selfhood benefit from depth, psychological understanding, and individuation work. But perhaps most people need both at different times, or even simultaneously. The person recovering from brain injury needs Goldstein's rehabilitation methods, but also needs to find meaning in their transformed existence, and Jung's framework might help with that existential dimension. The person in midlife crisis needs Jung's depth work, but also might need to develop practical skills and capacities they had neglected, and Goldstein's emphasis on actualizing capacities through real-world engagement might help with that functional dimension. This suggests a more integrative psychology than either Jung or Goldstein alone could provide. Such a psychology would be grounded in biological reality while remaining open to transcendent dimensions. It would take seriously the brain and nervous system's role in all psychological phenomena while refusing to reduce experience to neurological processes. It would honor both the functional and the meaningful, both the adaptive and the transformative, both the organismic and the spiritual. What would this integrative approach look like in practice? It would begin with careful assessment of the whole person in their actual situation, Goldstein's phenomenological method. What are the person's capacities and limitations? What situations trigger dysfunction? What patterns of behavior reveal about organismic organization? But it would also explore the person's subjective experience, their dreams and fantasies, their sense of meaning and purpose, their relationship to the symbolic dimension, Jung's depth psychological method. What is the psyche trying to communicate? What archetypal patterns are constellated? What transformation is seeking to occur? Treatment would address multiple levels simultaneously. Practical behavioral work to expand functional capacities, exploration of symbolic contents to facilitate psychological integration, attention to meaning and purpose, support for transformation, recognition that healing might require both developing new skills and undergoing spiritual awakening, both neural rehabilitation and soul-making, both functional improvement and the discovery of authentic selfhood. The therapist in this integrative approach would need training in multiple modalities, knowledge of neurology and brain function, skill in behavioral assessment and rehabilitation, understanding of archetypal patterns and symbolic interpretation, capacity for holding space for transformation, wisdom to know when to emphasize which dimension, when to be practical and when to explore depths, when to focus on function and when to seek meaning. Such integration remains more aspiration than achievement in contemporary psychology. The field has fragmented into specialized approaches that often cannot speak to each other. Cognitive behavioral therapy, with its focus on thoughts and behaviors, occupies territory closer to Goldstein. Depth psychologies, with their focus on unconscious contents and meaning, occupy territory closer to Jung. Neuropsychology emphasizes brain function. Humanistic and existential therapies emphasize meaning and growth. Each approach has evidence supporting its effectiveness for certain conditions, yet none works for everyone. Perhaps the fragmentation is inevitable given the complexity of human beings. Perhaps no single framework can encompass everything, and we need specialized approaches for different problems. But perhaps the fragmentation also reflects theoretical rigidity, practitioners' attachments to particular schools, and economic pressures that favor brief, manualized treatments over comprehensive, individualized care. The dialogue between Jung and Goldstein suggests possibilities for integration that contemporary psychology has not fully realized. Beyond therapy, this dialogue illuminates perennial philosophical questions. What is a human being? We are organisms striving toward self-realization, yes. We are also souls journeying toward individuation. These are not contradictory, but complementary truths. We are embodied consciousnesses whose very embodiment enables consciousness that can reflect on its own existence, seek meaning, and experience transcendence. We are matter that somehow becomes aware of itself, biology that generates psychology, organisms that create symbol and myth. What is the good life? For Goldstein, it is the life of complete self-realization, where the organism fully actualizes its capacities in adequate engagement with the world. For Jung, it is the individuated life, where consciousness relates creatively to unconscious depths, where ego and self are in dialogue, where the personality achieves wholeness through integration of opposites. Again, these are complementary rather than contradictory. The good life requires both adequate functioning in the world and authentic selfhood, both practical mastery and spiritual depth, both horizontal expansion of capacities and vertical descent into soul. What is consciousness, and what is its place in nature? This remains mysterious. Goldstein's naturalism suggests consciousness is fully part of nature, an aspect of organismic functioning. Jung's depth psychology suggests consciousness participates in dimensions that transcend ordinary nature, connecting to a psychoid realm where mind and matter interpenetrate. Perhaps both are true. Consciousness is both natural and transcendent, both biological and spiritual, both explicable and mysterious. This paradox might not be resolvable, but must be lived with, holding the tension between naturalistic and transcendent understandings. What happens after death? Here, Jung and Goldstein diverge most sharply. Goldstein, as a naturalist, would presumably accept that death ends organismic functioning and therefore ends consciousness. There is no self-realization beyond life, no continuation after the organism ceases. Jung was less certain. His psychology opened onto questions of survival after death, reincarnation, and the transpersonal nature of the psyche. While he did not claim certain knowledge, he believed consciousness might participate in dimensions not entirely dependent on individual bodily existence. The archetypes, being transpersonal, might transcend individual life and death. The self, as the totality beyond ego, might continue in ways we cannot comprehend. This disagreement cannot be resolved empirically. It reflects their different starting points and fundamental orientations. Goldstein's commitment to naturalism requires accepting death as final. Jung's openness to transpersonal dimensions allows considering possibilities beyond bodily dissolution. Each person must decide which orientation resonates with their own intuitions and experiences. Yet even here, there is a curious convergence. Both Jung and Goldstein emphasize that the quality of life matters more than its continuation. Goldstein's emphasis on self-realization meant living fully in the present, actualizing capacities now, not postponing life for some future reward. Jung's emphasis on individuation meant the transformation of consciousness in this life, not merely preparing for some afterlife. Both rejected using thoughts of death as escape from life's demands. Both called us to engage fully with existence as we find it. In their different ways, both Jung and Goldstein were humanists, believing in human potential for growth and transformation. Both rejected deterministic views that saw humans as merely passive products of past causes. Both emphasized agency, creativity, and the possibility of becoming more fully oneself. Both insisted that human beings could not be understood through the categories applied to mere things or even to non-human animals. We are special. Whether understood as organisms with unique capacities for abstraction and self-realization, or as conscious beings capable of encountering archetypal depths and spiritual transcendence. This humanism feels particularly important now, in an age when various forms of reductionism threaten to explain away human distinctiveness. Genetic determinism suggests we are merely vehicles for selfish genes. Neuroscientific reductionism suggests we are merely our brains, with consciousness and illusion and free will impossible. Evolutionary psychology suggests all our behaviors serve adaptive functions. Established in the Pleistocene, artificial intelligence threatens to replace human intelligence with machine computation. Against all these reductions, Jung and Goldstein remind us human beings are complex wholes, organisms striving toward self-realization, souls journeying toward individuation, conscious beings who create meaning and seek transcendence. Yet their humanism was not naive. Both recognized human limitations, the constraints of biology and circumstance, the difficulty of transformation, the ubiquity of suffering. Goldstein worked with catastrophically brain-injured soldiers, seeing how neural damage could devastate personality and capacity. He knew that some limitations could not be overcome, that healing sometimes meant learning to live within constraints. Jung worked with severely disturbed patients at Bergholzli, seeing how psychosis could shatter coherent consciousness. He knew that individuation was not everyone's path, that some people needed supportive care more than transformative work. Their realism balanced their humanism. Yes, growth and transformation are possible. Yes, we can become more fully ourselves. But this requires work, courage, and often suffering. It requires confronting what we would rather avoid for Goldstein, the demands that might produce catastrophic anxiety. For Jung, the shadow and other unconscious contents we have disowned. There are no shortcuts, no easy techniques that bypass the difficult journey of becoming whole. Both demanded honesty about where we actually are, acceptance of reality, including its limitations, and commitment to the long work of development. In this, they model a mature psychology that neither inflates nor deflates human possibilities. We are neither gods nor machines, neither purely spiritual nor purely material. We are finite beings with capacities for transcendence, organisms whose biology enables consciousness that can wonder at its own existence, creatures caught between earth and heaven, matter and spirit, necessity and freedom. Our task is to live this paradox fully, accepting both our limits and our possibilities, both our embodiment and our capacity for meaning. As you approach sleep now, let these reflections settle into your deepest awareness. Feel how you are both organism and soul, both biological being and meaning seeker, both functioning in the world and yearning for something beyond. Jung and Goldstein speak to different dimensions of your being, each voice necessary, each offering gifts. Goldstein grounds you in your embodied reality, in your actual capacities and circumstances, in the practical work of living adequately in the world. Jung invites you into depth, into dream and symbol, into the transformative encounter with what lies beneath consciousness, into the journey toward wholeness. Tonight, as you sleep, your brain will continue its organismic functioning neurons, firing in patterns that consolidate memories, regulate bodily processes, and generate dreams. Goldstein's perspective helps us appreciate this biological marvel, this organism striving toward optimal functioning even in sleep. But your dreams themselves might contain symbols and images that point beyond mere neural firing, a wise figure offering guidance, a journey through strange landscapes, a numinous encounter that leaves you changed upon waking. Jung's perspective helps us receive these gifts from the depths, recognizing in them the psyche's own creative wisdom, the self's orchestration of your ongoing individuation. You are both of these realities simultaneously, and any psychology that honors only one dimension fails to meet you in your full humanity. You are an organism that has become conscious of itself, matter that wonders at its own existence, biology that creates meaning. You are capable of both careful observation of how you function and profound encounter with the symbolic dimensions of existence. You need both Goldstein's description, Jung's interpretation, both functional understanding and mythic imagination, both neural rehabilitation and soul-making. The conversation between these two great thinkers continues in you, as you navigate your own path between embodiment and transcendence, between practical functioning and meaningful existence. You do not need to choose between their perspectives, but can hold them both, letting each inform and correct the other, using both languages to articulate the mystery of your being. Perhaps this is the deepest gift their dialogue offers, the recognition that human beings are complex enough to require multiple languages, multiple frameworks, multiple ways of seeing. We are not simple beings that can be captured in a single theory or described by a single method. We are layered, multidimensional, paradoxical. We are organisms whose functioning mysteriously generates consciousness. We are consciousnesses whose depths extend into an unconscious ground. We are individuals whose psychology connects to collective patterns. We are biological creatures capable of spiritual experience. We are temporal beings who encounter eternal truths. We are determined by past causes, yet capable of creative freedom. We are limited, yet capable of transcendence. Jung and Goldstein each captured essential truths about this paradoxical nature, even as each necessarily left other truths partially obscured. Together, in dialogue, they create a richer picture than either alone could provide. This is how knowledge advances, not through one theory defeating another, but through creative synthesis that preserves the insights of multiple perspectives while overcoming their one-sidedness. As contemporary psychology continues to develop, it might find wisdom in returning to this dialogue. The field has made tremendous advances in understanding the brain, mapping neural circuits, identifying genes related to behavior, developing effective treatments for specific disorders. All this represents progress in the direction Goldstein pioneered toward biological understanding of organismic functioning. Yet there is also growing recognition that something is lost when human experience is reduced to neural mechanisms, when meaning is dismissed as mere byproduct, when spiritual yearnings are pathologized rather than honored. Jung's insistence on the reality and importance of the symbolic dimension, on consciousness's participation in dimensions that transcend biology, on the necessity of meaning and purpose for psychological health, all this remains vital. Perhaps the future of psychology lies in integration that honors both directions toward neural mechanism and toward spiritual meaning, toward biological grounding, and toward transcendent possibility, toward Goldstein's organism and Jung's soul. Such integration requires intellectual humility, recognizing that we do not yet have final answers to the deepest questions. It requires methodological pluralism, using different methods for different questions rather than insisting one method must answer everything. It requires respecting human experience in its full depth and complexity rather than reducing it to what current theories can easily accommodate. The mystery of consciousness, of selfhood, of human existence remains. Jung and Goldstein devoted their lives to exploring this mystery, each from a different angle, each with different tools and assumptions. Neither solved the mystery, perhaps it cannot be solved, but only lived more consciously, more completely, more authentically. But both expanded our understanding, gave us languages for articulating aspects of the mystery, and modeled the serious, sustained attention to human existence that any adequate psychology requires. In their dedication to understanding human beings in their complexity, in their refusal of simplistic reductions, in their respect for individual uniqueness, in their belief in possibilities for growth and transformation, Jung and Goldstein were kindred spirits despite their theoretical differences. Both were healers who took their patients' suffering seriously. Both were scientists who observed carefully and thought deeply. Both were humanists who honored human dignity and potential. Both were teachers who passed on frameworks that continue to illuminate human existence. As you drift now into sleep's embrace, carry with you this sense of being seen from multiple perspectives, understood in multiple languages, held in multiple frameworks. You are Goldstein's organism striving towards self-realization, actualizing capacities, seeking adequate engagement with your world. You are also Jung's individu, journeying through symbol and myth, encountering autonomous contents of the unconscious, transforming toward wholeness. You are both, and more than both, a unique human being whose life cannot be fully captured by any theory, yet deserves to be met with the full resources of psychological understanding. Let sleep come naturally now, as your organism shifts into its own self-regulating patterns of rest and restoration. Let dreams arise from whatever depths they come, carrying whatever symbols and meanings they bear. Trust your own process, your own unfolding, your own path toward whatever wholeness means for you. You are held in the great mystery of consciousness, of existence itself, and that mystery is worthy of wonder, reverence, and the kind of serious attention that Jung and Goldstein, each in their way, devoted to it. The dialogue between organism and soul, between function and meaning, between biology and spirit continues. It continues in academic journals and therapy offices, in research laboratories and meditation halls, in neurological clinics and depth analysis. But most importantly, it continues in each person's lived experience, as we navigate our path between earth and heaven, between the practical demands of embodied existence and the call toward transcendent meaning. Jung and Goldstein are our guides on this journey, each illuminating aspects of the territory we must traverse. Goldstein maps the organism's striving, its capacities and limitations, its functional organization and adaptive possibilities. Jung maps the psyche's depths, its symbolic language, its archetypal patterns and transformative potential. Together, they suggest that the path toward wholeness requires both outward expansion of functional capacities and inward descent into soul's depths. both horizontal development and vertical integration, both becoming more capable in the world and more conscious of the eternal patterns that structure human existence. There is no final synthesis that would resolve all tensions between their perspectives into perfect unity. The tension itself is productive, creative, necessary. Human beings require multiple languages because we exist at the intersection of multiple dimensions, biological and spiritual, temporal and eternal, determined and free. The conversation between these dimensions never ends because it constitutes our very being. We are the beings in whom organism and soul, function and meaning, biology and spirit meet and interpenetrate. So rest now in this mysterious meeting place, this intersection of dimensions that you are. Be at peace with paradox, with complexity, with the limits of what can be known or articulated. Let both Jung's depth and Goldstein's clarity inform your sense of self. Let both symbolic imagination and functional understanding guide your path. Let both the call to individuation and the drive towards self-realization motivate your development. You are large enough, complex enough, mysterious enough to need all the wisdom both perspectives can offer. The night deepens, consciousness recedes, sleep approaches. Yet even in sleep, you continue the organism self-regulating, the psyche generating dreams, the mysterious process of being continuing its unfoldment. Trust that process. Trust your own depths. Trust the wisdom encoded in your biology and the wisdom emerging from your soul's journey. Trust that you are held in something larger than personal consciousness, whether we call it the self or the organism's holistic functioning or the mystery of existence itself. Welcome, sleep, now as both biological necessity and spiritual opportunity, both organismic restoration and potential encounter with the depths. Your dreams may carry symbols from the collective unconscious, or may simply reflect the organism's total processing of the day's events. Perhaps both descriptions are true. Perhaps dreams are precisely the place where biology and symbol meet, where organism and soul speak to each other, where the multiple dimensions of human existence interpenetrate most obviously. May your sleep be deep and restorative. May your dreams be meaningful, whether interpreted symbolically or understood functionally. May you wake refreshed in both organism and soul, ready to continue the journey toward whatever wholeness is possible for you. May the dialogue between Jung and Goldstein, between depth and surface, between meaning and function, between spirit and biology, continue to enrich your understanding of yourself and your fellow human beings. And may you carry forward in your own life the best of what both these great thinkers offered: Goldstein's respect for biological reality and functional understanding, his emphasis on actualizing capacities through real-world engagement, his practical wisdom about working with limitations, and Jung's respect for the symbolic dimension and spiritual yearning, his emphasis on transformation through depth work, his visionary wisdom about the psyche's autonomous creative powers. The conversation between them is not merely historical but ongoing, not merely theoretical but practical, not merely intellectual but existential. It lives wherever someone asks, "What does my life mean? How can I become more fully myself? What is this consciousness that I am? How can I heal what is broken in me? Where is wisdom to be found?" These questions require multiple frameworks, multiple languages, multiple ways of seeing. Jung and Goldstein together offer richer resources for addressing them than either alone could provide. So sleep now, dear listener, held in the mystery of your own being, that paradoxical reality that is both organism and soul, both biological and spiritual, both explicable and mysterious. Sleep in the confidence that your depths are wise, your organism is self-regulating, your path unfolds according to its own timing. Sleep in the peace that comes from accepting human complexity, from letting go of the need for single answers, from trusting that multiple perspectives together reveal more than any one alone. The story of Jung and Goldstein is the story of two ways of seeing, two languages for articulating human existence, two frameworks that both illuminate essential truths. It is a story without simple resolution, without one victor and one defeated, without final synthesis that would eliminate all tension. It is, rather, a continuing dialogue, a creative conversation that enriches our understanding precisely by maintaining productive tension between complementary perspectives. May this dialogue live in you, inform your self-understanding, guide your path toward wholeness. May you be grounded like Goldstein's organism and deep like Jung's soul. May you function adequately in the world while remaining open to transcendent meaning. May you actualize your capacities while individuating toward the self. May you be both and more than both, a full human being, complex and paradoxical, mysterious and knowable, limited and capable of transcendence. Good night, wanderer. Rest well in the mystery of consciousness and existence. Let Goldstein's organism restore itself through sleep's biological rhythms. Let Jung's psyche speak through dreams from the depths. And wake tomorrow ready to continue the great work of becoming who you are, guided by both biological wisdom and spiritual intuition, both functional understanding and symbolic imagination, both the drive towards self-realization and the call to individuation. The night is deep now. Words fade into silence. Consciousness dissolves into sleep. Yet something continues, something that both Jung and Goldstein devoted their lives to understanding, something that remains mysterious despite all theories and frameworks. That something is you organism and soul, body and spirit, being and becoming, actual and potential, limited and infinite. Rest in that mystery. It is your home. Good night.